The strongest feeling that I was left with after finishing Return of the Obra Dinn was that I hope it's the birth of a genre. Other mystery games do exist, of course, but none of them are like this one. It could be the pioneer that inspires other games and copycats. And my hope that this will happen is so strong because as wonderful as my experience was with Obra Dinn, I think it could be taken much further. If there is even the slightest possibility that you are going to play this in the future, then I caution you to stop watching this video. This is both a puzzle and a mystery game, so almost anything can be a spoiler. Plus, one of its best and most surprising moments happens in the first 30 minutes, when you realize that you're actually playing as Raiden and not Solid Snake. No, I'm serious, this video will be waiting for you afterward, whereas your chance to play this game blind can be taken away forever. Now I'm going to summarize the game real quick, which may seem stupid after that big of a spoiler warning, but I know many people watch these videos before playing the game no matter how much I caution against it. Plus, I like these videos to be close to timeless as possible, meaning that if you're watching this years in the future and may not remember some parts of the game, then I can refresh your memory first. If you've ever wondered about that strange contradiction with summaries and spoiler warnings in my videos, then there you go. Lucas Pope, the creator of Return of the Obra Dinn, also takes a stab at being timeless in a more extreme way that should be immediately apparent. Its art style already looked ancient before the game was released. I am legally mandated to mention that Lucas Pope also made Papers, Please, and can use that to point out the similar quality that game has in its art style. I think Papers, Please is more successful with its use, even though Return of the Obra Dinn is a much more complicated game visually. You're studying the shapes of faces much more in Papers, Please, and the art style complements that gameplay, whereas in Return of the Obra Dinn, I felt like it only ever improved the atmosphere and occasionally got in the way of the gameplay. Despite saying that, I think the game's presentation is its greatest success. There's something deeply charming about how the music bumps along when you're clicking through messages and following instructions as they crop parts of the screen to steal your focus. The game also uses full-screen subtitles like something out of a silent movie, even though the game is fully voice-acted. I felt like my attention was being gently arrested in these segments, and then immersed into moments frozen in time, like being suddenly submerged into a situation after being caught secretly eavesdropping. If you haven't played, you may be wondering how that works. Going into the game, I already knew it was about inspecting freeze-frame scenes for some purpose. I expected that they would all be murders, and that this ability to see back in time to when the murder occurred would be some translated ability of your character turned into a gameplay system. They are some sort of inspector that is able to see many details in the environment that you are unable to, perhaps because of the art style, and this is how the player is able to play the role as an accomplished detective when they are unlikely to have the abilities of one. Turns out I was wrong on both counts. You are not always figuring out murders. They are explicitly stated to be fates, and while many of them are murders, sometimes they are accidents or conclude with someone escaping and surviving. You are also not able to see these time-stilled vignettes through your character's keen deductive capabilities, but through a supernatural pocket watch that allows the user to experience the final moments of whatever corpse, or what remains of one, that it is pointed at. I was happy to be wrong about both of these expectations. The broader conclusions you can come to on the fates of the Obra Dinn's crew and passengers allows for more variety in deductions and sleuthing, and the prevalence of paranormal events continues to increase as you explore the snapshots of death throughout the ship. The biggest surprise, and the one my spoiler warning referenced, was the Kraken Attack that left bodies littered on Obra Dinn's deck. It was one of a few moments during the game that I didn't pay attention to what my dead subject had gone through and instead gawked at the scene around me. The Obra Dinn's voyage was cursed, perhaps literally. The ship has returned after being missing for 4 or so years, and like many stories about lost ships, is completely abandoned. Most of the crew has been killed, and the captain has not been whisked off to become the King of Limbo. He's committed suicide, and his corpse is in his room. This is one of the first things that you piece together after climbing on board the ship and begin your investigation as an insurance agent for the East India Company. Your magical pocket watch also came with a book that was staggeringly overwhelming when I first played the game. It has many blank pages that you will fill, a roster of the ship's crew and passengers, and a drawing to use as a visual reference. Your goal is to identify 60 people and determine their fates through a ship-wide game of Slain Sailor Sudoku. plus a bit of Clue the board game, which is one of my favorites because I am a board game normie. You fill this list through observations and deductions. In almost every case, how someone died or escaped is the straightforward part, either through visual information in each death scene or from listening to the short radio play before the scene springs to life. It's the identities of each person that's usually the tricky part, and also where the death scenes become intertwined, since someone who is killed may have also killed someone else before that. In cases of murder, Obra Dinn also wants to know who is responsible, not just how it happened. This is where Clue and Sudoku become relevant, since only a few identities are blatantly told to you. I also want to point out here that even when this does happen, with someone being outright named, it always feels natural and nothing like the game is throwing you a freebie. These probably still are free spaces in practice, but the writing was careful enough to make them not feel patronizing, and I appreciate that, with only one possible exception, which I'm just going to put on the screen. The book will lock in answers if you get 3 correct at any time. This gives you vital bursts of information whenever you get 3 correct, because not only do you no longer have to wonder if these 3 names belong to anyone else for the other scenes, you also know that any entries you made on other fates that weren't locked in with this round have false information. This is usually the identities of people, which you now know to switch to a different choice. The game brilliantly mixes short-term observations with long-term ones, so something direct being noticing an accent or a foreign language being used by someone in a death scene. Whereas a realization you may build to over the course of the game, perhaps heavily influenced by your knowledge of seafaring vessels in this era, or a lack of, will be that the role each person had on the ship can be more important than their names. Officers tend to stand together, so do topmen, midshipmen, seamen, passengers, and many who share a nationality. There are many different ways to pin down the identity of each person, and it's likely that most players get through the roster in dramatically different orders. There are also many easily missed clues, and I'd wager that the player that notices absolutely everything will have a breeze of a time finishing the roster. It's just highly unlikely that that will happen. A big one that I missed was that you can use the hammocks in one scene to identify people. Observations can be used like seeds in this way. It gets planted in your mind and then grows through multiple scenes and fates. You might catch that someone is angry that another character allegedly killed their brother, and now you know to look for 2 crew members with the same last name. If you already have 2 fates correct, then you can alternate between these 2 brothers to get 3 correct. Then you not only know that it's the remaining brother if you ever see that alleged murder scene later, which you do, but you also get another chance to cycle your names on other fates to other people you suspected but weren't sure of. When I played, there were a few times when identifying just one person set off a chain reaction of multiple sets of lock-ins in a row, and it was like an exciting rush of so many pieces falling into place because of one thing that I noticed. This may sound like guesswork, and to some extent it is. From what I've read on the game after finishing it, there is a way to accurately identify every person on the Obra Dinn without having to resort to these tactics, but I'd be a liar if I said I didn't take shots in the dark that ended up being correct. One that happened early on was that I noticed there were only 2 female passengers on board, and that they were among a group of 4 that escaped by boat. By cycling through nearby destinations and switching the names of these 2 women, I was able to lock them into the correct solution in less than a minute. There were a few times throughout the game that I was able to use this method to successfully solidify fates. Sometimes I felt like I was being clever and rightly playing the game within a few of the options I had narrowed my search down to, like noticing a group of Russians playing cards and then knowing to cycle their identities between the only Russians on board if they were ever passed over during a lock-in. But occasionally I felt like I was exploiting the omnipotent guidance of the game and eliminating a name off my list without any tangible piece of evidence to support it. I hadn't earned it. This is made easier to do by the sheer volume of death scenes you will find on the ship. One corpse can lead to another corpse within the frozen flashback itself, with a dive into a fate within a fate like a Russian doll of death. These scenes are separated into chapters in your book that match a specific date of the Obra Dinn's voyage, something that's also marked by where the hands of your pocket watch wind back to upon use. Each chapter tells its own snapshot of a story that is usually presented to you in backwards order. So corpses you see at first become people who are dying, to moments before their accident or attack, to blissfully unaware of what is about to happen to them. 3 fates do not have to be locked in within each chapter, and most chapters have significant chunks of information that are easy to notice, usually causes of death, and at least one name that isn't too difficult to pencil in. These can then trigger lock-ins across the whole ship, and since those are such valuable explosions of information, there are ample opportunities for a bit of cheese via guesswork. However, while it is true that most of the causes of death are straightforward, there are a few notable exceptions that shine a light on how Obra Dinn succeeds. The two examples I want to use both involve guns. The first is a death during an attack carried out by these cloaked crab riders, which was also the second coolest wow moment I had in the game when I peered through this window and saw them for the first time. I'd guess this is intentional misdirection to make you focus on the monsters when this guy was actually killed by another crew member who was trying to shoot the crab rider and missed, shooting through the wall and hitting our victim instead. This required careful inspection of the scene to notice the path of the bullet, and then the crew member responsible, who is too far away from you to zoom in on to link his identity in the drawing, so you have to keep it in mind as you trace his actions through the other death scenes and work out who it is. The other example is when you get to investigate that drawing in person in a Death Watch scene, which was another unexpectedly awesome part of the game and had me running around the scene while flipping back to the drawing confirming it all. Someone is executed in this freeze frame via firing squad, and it is such a natural but still incredible click moment when you realize that you have to study the bullets and follow them back to the 4 rifles to work out which one of them landed the killing shot, and therefore goes into the book next to the cause of death. And also some philosophical musings about firing squads and who's really responsible for killing. There are a few other moments like this in the game where you have to really soak in the details to determine something. It's odd to me that the game is mostly tricky when it comes to figuring out identities when it was these types of contained puzzles that I felt were the strongest parts of it. Unfortunately, there are a few times that the game goes wrong with this system and you are left guessing in a bad way. And this is almost entirely the fault of the art style. Deaths from burning were difficult for me to understand, especially since it was often from an unexplained and supernatural source. One death appeared like a strangulation until I took a stab at a knife being mostly obscured from view in the killer's hand, and there are still a few deaths where I'm not entirely sure if the victim was clawed, speared, or burned. Thankfully, in many cases, like this one with the Kraken either crushing or strangling this victim, the game will accept multiple answers. But I do have to wonder if the art style ended up being a limitation on nitty-gritty clues for deaths because of a lack of clarity and detail. However, that was probably a good trade-off, since this same art style likely made these more outlandish death scenes possible for more variety and creativity on a broad scale for an indie game made by just one person. It's still something I find myself thinking about, what a game like this would look like if it had a traditional art style and a larger budget so it could have this freedom without the limitations. It's also worth noting that many of the options in your cause of death list are never used. This works to make things a little more difficult for you, but also to keep your imagination going about fates you haven't seen yet. In general, it's a great way to avoid the problem that I spoke about in my Prey video, about multiple choices potentially giving away the answer or prompting the player to start suspecting something only because it's an answer. Return of the Obra Dinn still uses a multiple choice system, but succeeds by having so many options and possibilities. Although I do have one final complaint about it, deaths caused by the riders on top of the crabs seemed much more like foreign enemies to me and not beasts, whereas the game would not accept this answer and had to have beasts like the riders are the same as the crabs below them or the giant kraken outside. Those crab riders are one of a few supernatural elements in the story that are never fully explained, and I'm okay with that. What was disappointing though was the chapter held back from you during your investigation on the boat. This is the game's true ending, and you only see it if you correctly determine the identities and fates of everyone available while you're searching the ship. You can leave without finishing them all or even put in false information. I believe there's an achievement for erroneously blaming everything on the captain. You mail the book back to Henry Evans, the ship's surgeon who escaped with 3 others to Africa and who sent you both the book and pocket watch at the beginning, and you are mailed back the means to witness the final section of the Obra Dinn story as a reward. That story is a simple one that is told in a complex way. It's also a rare example of it being done well in order to facilitate gameplay and some strong narrative moments, but it fails to provide satisfying closure. In summary, a group of Formosan passengers were transporting a magical artifact in a chest on the ship. One of them can be seen guarding the door to where this chest is being kept in more than one death scene. Perhaps after noticing this, the ship's second mate, Edward Nichols, began to plot with several others on board the ship to steal this chest and abduct 2 of the Formosans. After doing this, they attempt to escape the Obra Dinn with what they think is treasure when they are instead attacked by merfolk that seem to be drawn to whatever is in the chest. There's a struggle between those on the boats and the merfolk, and the chest is opened in order to subdue them, killing one of the Formosans in the process. At least 3 of these merfolk are then taken back on board the Obra Dinn, since most of the traders in Nichols' group were killed in this struggle, and Nichols himself is killed trying to get back onto the Obra Dinn. Unfortunately for the crew of the ship, these merfolk were not the only forces lurking in the ocean below them. It's never explained what exactly they are or how they communicate, but the Obra Dinn is attacked by these beasts since the humans are holding 3 merfolk captive in a part of the ship used for storage called the lazarette. The crab riders come first, which the crew fends off while taking major casualties. Next comes the Kraken, which is a problem the captain resolves by persuading the captive merfolk to call off the attack. Then the last surviving mermaid or mer-person is thrown back into the ocean after another officer strikes a deal with it to guide the Obra Dinn back to England in return for its freedom. Some people then abandon the ship. Others, driven by greed or perhaps madness from what they just witnessed, fight against the dejected captain, and the result is the condition of the ship that you find it in when you climb aboard. Of course, with none of the overlapping spectral bodies of all those who died showing up just yet. And that's the whole story of what happened. That's the whole story in Return of the Obra Dinn. It's not bad, but it's not great either. It's serviceable, and it's one of the biggest reasons why I hope there will be other games that try to recreate this type of experience. Because the most disappointing thing about this story is that it's teased as a big revelation in the book each time you flip through it, and it also matches the type of outcomes you reach when you lock in fates. It feels like it's building into this cascade of a conclusion when instead, while cool, it barely shows anything new. The images of the captain roaring in desperation as he impales the captive merfolk are undoubtedly powerful, but didn't realign the whole story together for me in a way like Uncovering the Mysteries did. The more impressive part here is how you are sent through these final layered scenes of death. The surgeon who sends the book back to you is fully aware of how the pocket watch works, and must have been using it himself before he sent it your way. He sacrifices his monkey companion, who you can see earlier on the ship, as a way to save a method to return to this nested ball of death. A piece of the dead monkey allows you to relive that death, which is next to another body in the lazarette, which leads to other corpses of the merfolk and one other human, and it's certainly not an accident that it's a monkey's paw that you use. This is an incredibly smart way of incorporating this gameplay piece back into the story, but it raised further questions for me and has become a source of disappointment more and more as I think about the game. The strength of its presentation has never wavered, but it reconfirms the pocket watch as a known power in Obra Dinn's world. The surgeon is not just aware of it, but willing to give it up in a risky way. It's used in the narrative, and it isn't just a gameplay mechanic manifested for the game to use. Does this mean that magical artifacts are common in this alternate version of Earth, as well as ocean beasts or even monsters on dry land? Was the usage of this magical pocket watch an acceptable source of information for your insurance report, or did your character falsify the proof that supports their conclusions through some special capability after all? I feel compelled to state that I am not saying these are plot holes. I know I can drill too hard on those in other videos. That isn't what I'm doing here. Instead, I'm pointing out how it may have been interesting to explore these ideas since the story doesn't really go anywhere. Which is understandable when you think of how many deaths the story had to support. There had to be multiple slaughters for this game to function, and I don't want to diminish the work that went into making sure they were all interesting and smoothly overlapped with the other chapters. And I think the game was successful in doing both of those things. I don't think the story was really the point. It's about the mysteries and the crew and the presentation doing its best to fuel the uniquely experimental deductive gameplay. But that's sort of my point here. I hope that this is the first game of its type that will be honored and respected, but still seen as a stepping stone that led to something that did it far better. A Super Machiavelli 3 to Return of the Obra Dinn's Mario Brothers. It feels like the most refined and polished proof of concept that I've ever played, and I mean that in the best way possible. I don't regret a single minute I spent with this game. If you did not play Return of the Obra Dinn yourself and decided to listen to me instead, I still think it's worth your time. Despite the solutions I showed and going through the entire story, games are always meant to be played instead of watched. It's a much different experience when you can feel it for yourself, and there's nothing else like it right now, so I hope you still consider giving it a run of your own. Thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed the video.